The morning sun streamed through the airport's tall windows as Dorothy Jenkins wheeled her burgundy leather suitcase toward the Southern Airways check-in counter. She'd made this trip dozens of times before. The regular flight from Atlanta to Chicago for her grandchildren's winter recitals. But today felt different, maybe because it was her first flight since retiring from her 40-year career as an investment banker. She dressed carefully that morning, her favorite navy blue business suit, pearl earrings, and the golden brooch her late husband had given her on their 30th anniversary. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her platinum frequent flyer card sat ready in her hand alongside her first-class ticket. The check-in line moved quickly. Dorothy watched as passengers ahead of her were processed efficiently. A young couple with matching backpacks, a businessman typing furiously on his phone, a mother with two sleepy children. But when Dorothy stepped up to the counter, the warm smile on the agent's face flickered and faded. "Good morning," Dorothy said, placing her ID and first-class ticket on the counter. "I have a window seat in first class." The agent, whose name had read Linda, picked up the ticket with pinched fingers, as if holding something suspicious. "There must be some mistake," she said, not meeting Dorothy's eyes. "Let me verify this." Dorothy's heart sank, but her voice remained steady. "There's no mistake. I booked this ticket 3 months ago. I always fly first class on this route." Linda made a show of typing into her computer, her acrylic nails clicking against the keyboard. "I'll need to get my supervisor to check this," she said, picking up her phone. Behind Dorothy, the line grew longer, and she could feel the impatient shuffling of other passengers. Minutes ticked by. Dorothy stood straight, her hand resting on her suitcase handle, ignoring the whispers and stares from those waiting in line. She'd faced moments like this before, in boardrooms, at country clubs, in high-end stores. 40 years in the banking industry had taught her that dignity was her best armor. A supervisor appeared, a man with a red face and a too-tight collar. He barely glanced at Dorothy before huddling with Linda over the computer screen. More typing. More frowning. More minutes passing. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the supervisor finally said, his voice dripping with false regret. "It appears first class has been overbooked. We'll have to move you to economy. Of course, we'll refund the difference in fare." Dorothy opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, a young white man in a crisp suit stepped up to the counter next to her. Linda's face brightened immediately. "Good morning, sir. First class to Chicago. Let me check you in right away." Dorothy watched as the man was promptly issued a first-class boarding pass, possibly for the very seat she booked months ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the economy ticket and the promise of a refund, but her voice remained calm. "Thank you for your time," she said quietly. As she walked away from the counter, Dorothy's mind wasn't on the humiliation she just endured. Instead, she was thinking about assets, stock portfolios, and corporate vulnerabilities. She was thinking about her old colleagues in the merger and acquisition department. She was thinking about justice, not the loud, immediate kind, but the slow, methodical kind that changed systems from the inside out. Settling into her cramped economy seat, Dorothy pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. As the other passengers boarded, she began making calls. The first was to her investment manager. The second was to her lawyer. By the time the flight took off, Dorothy Jenkins had already set in motion a plan that would change not just her future flights, but the entire airline industry. The economy cabin felt like it was closing in around Dorothy as she watched other passengers board the plane. Her knees pressed against the seat in front of her, a far cry from the spacious first-class accommodation she'd booked. A young man struggled with his oversized backpack in the narrow aisle, accidentally bumping her shoulder. "Sorry, ma'am," he mumbled, not really looking at her. She closed her eyes, trying to find her center. The air felt different back here, stuffier, more confined. The smell of reheated coffee and too many people packed too closely together filled her nostrils. Through the thin curtains separating the cabins, She could glimpse the first-class passengers being served pre-flight beverages in real glasses. Her original seat, 2A, was now occupied by the young businessman from the check-in counter, who was already reclining with a complimentary newspaper. Dorothy pulled out her phone again, opening her photos. There, smiling back at her, was a picture from last month's retirement party. She stood in the center of the investment firm's main conference room, surrounded by her team. For 40 years, she'd broken barriers in the banking industry. She'd started as a junior clerk in 1983, working twice as hard as everyone else, earning every promotion, every accolade. By the time she retired, she was managing portfolios worth billions. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, asking everyone to prepare for takeoff. As Dorothy buckled her seatbelt, noticeably more worn than the ones in first class, memories flooded back. She remembered her first major corporate acquisition in 1995, how the board of directors had initially mistaken her for a secretary. She remembered the client who'd refused to believe she was the senior investment advisor, asking to speak to the real banker. Each time, she'd responded not with anger, but with excellence. A baby started crying somewhere behind her. The seat in front of her reclined suddenly, squeezing her space even further. Dorothy pulled out her small notebook, the one she'd carried throughout her career, and began writing. Her pen moved quickly across the paper as she jotted down names, numbers, and ideas. She'd learned long ago that the best way to fight systemic disrespect wasn't with loud protests or angry confrontations. Real change required strategy, patience, and most importantly, power. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the drink service began. When the cart reached her row, the flight attendant barely paused. "Water or juice?" she asked curtly, already reaching for a plastic cup. Dorothy thought about the fresh squeezed orange juice and hot coffee being served just a few rows ahead. "Water, please," she replied softly, but her mind was already elsewhere. She was thinking about Southern Airways' stock performance over the last quarter, about their recent management changes, about their vulnerabilities. She'd researched them before. All good investors knew their airlines. Their customer service ratings had been dropping, their debt was mounting, and their leadership was fractured. As the flight continued, Dorothy pulled up her banking app again. Her retirement portfolio was substantial. 4 decades of smart investments had seen to that. But more importantly, she had connections. Her phone contained the private numbers of some of the most powerful players in the financial industry. Many of them owed her favors, and others would jump at the opportunity she was beginning to formulate. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing her water to slosh in its flimsy plastic cup. Up in first class, she knew, drinks were served in glassware that flight attendants would quickly steady. The difference wasn't just about comfort. It was about dignity, about respect, about who was deemed worthy of basic courtesy. Dorothy straightened her back, ignoring the discomfort of the narrow seat. By the time this flight landed in Chicago, she would have the outline of a plan that would shake Southern Airways to its core. They thought they saw an elderly woman they could dismiss. What they actually saw was their future owner. They just didn't know it yet. Dorothy's grandchildren were waiting at Chicago O'Hare Airport, their faces lighting up as she walked through the arrival gate. Her grandson held up a handmade sign reading "World's Best Grandma," decorated with glitter and stars. For a moment, the morning's humiliation faded as she hugged them close, breathing in the scent of her granddaughter's strawberry shampoo. "How was your flight, Grandma?" her grandson asked, reaching for her carry-on bag. Dorothy paused, considering her answer. She'd always taught her grandchildren to face challenges with grace and strategy rather than immediate reaction. "It was educational," she said finally, giving them a warm smile. That evening, after the children's music recital, Dorothy sat in her hotel room with her laptop open. She'd excused herself early from the family dinner, claiming jet lag, but sleep was far from her mind. The room's desk was covered with papers, printouts of Southern Airways financial reports, news articles about their recent corporate struggles, and her own handwritten notes. She thought back to her early days in banking, when she'd first learned about corporate takeovers. Her mentor, one of the few who'd looked past her gender and color, had taught her that patience was the deadliest weapon in finance. The best moves, he'd said, are the ones your opponent doesn't see coming until it's too late. Dorothy opened her email and began composing messages to old colleagues. She was careful with her words, making no mention of discrimination or revenge. Instead, she wrote about investment opportunities, about an undervalued company with significant growth potential. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, each email personalized, each one hinting at the potential for substantial returns. Around midnight, her phone buzzed. It was a response from her former protégé, now a senior partner at one of the largest investment firms in Atlanta. Intriguing proposal. Let's talk details over breakfast tomorrow before your return flight. Dorothy smiled, remembering how she'd mentored him 20 years ago when no one else would give him a chance. He'd faced his own battles with discrimination, and she knew he'd understand the underlying motivation behind this venture without needing it spelled out. She spent the next hour reviewing Southern Airways' stock performance over the past 5 years. Their share price had been declining steadily, making them vulnerable to a takeover. Their customer service ratings were dropping, their fleet needed updating, and their corporate culture was stuck in the past. All signs pointed to a company ripe for change. As she prepared for bed, Dorothy caught her reflection in the hotel mirror. She saw more than just an elderly woman who'd been wronged. She saw decades of experience, a lifetime of navigating corporate waters, and a mind still sharp enough to orchestrate complex financial maneuvers. Southern Airways had seen an easy target to discriminate against. They should have seen a formidable opponent. Before turning off the lights, Dorothy made one final note in her planning document. Phase 1. Silent accumulation. She'd learned long ago that true power moves quietly. While Southern Airways executives congratulated themselves on another day of maintaining their outdated practices, they wouldn't notice their company slipping through their fingers. Her last thought before drifting off to sleep wasn't about revenge. It was about transformation, about taking something broken and turning it into something better. Yes, she would own the airline that had humiliated her, but more importantly, she would remake it into what it should have been all along. A company that treated everyone with dignity, regardless of their age, gender, or color. The next morning, Dorothy woke up early, put on her best business suit, and headed to breakfast with her former protégé. As she walked through the hotel lobby, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor, she felt a familiar energy building. The same energy that had helped her break through countless barriers throughout her career. This time, though, she wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for everyone who'd ever been told to take a seat at the back. Over the next few months, Dorothy's home office transformed into a command center. Her dining table disappeared under stacks of financial reports, market analyses, and airline industry newsletters. The wall calendar filled up with scheduled calls and meetings, each one bringing her closer to her goal. One rainy Tuesday morning, she sat at her desk, sipping her usual chamomile tea, when her computer pinged with an interesting email. A former colleague who now worked in Southern Airways' accounting department had sent her some interesting internal numbers, all public information, but buried deep in quarterly reports where few people bothered to look. Dorothy adjusted her reading glasses and leaned closer to the screen. The airline's debt was worse than she'd initially thought. They'd been covering it up with clever accounting, but the truth was there in the numbers. 3 delayed plane payments, 5 canceled route expansions, a pension fund that was running dangerously low. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her analysis. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, bringing over some homemade dumplings. "You're working too hard," Mrs. Chen said, eyeing the papers scattered everywhere. "Retirement should be for relaxing." Dorothy smiled, accepting the dumplings gratefully. "Sometimes the most important work comes after retirement," she replied. She hadn't told anyone except her closest confidants about her plans, but the work energized her more than any retirement hobby could. Back at her desk, Dorothy opened another email, this one from a flight attendants union representative. The message detailed growing dissatisfaction among Southern Airways staff. Low wages, inconsistent schedules, and most importantly, numerous complaints about discriminatory practices that management had ignored. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd called many times over the past weeks. Thomas? I've got some new information about those employee satisfaction numbers we discussed. Thomas, her former protégé, had become her closest ally in this venture. His investment firm was ready to move, just waiting for the right moment. As she talked, Dorothy pulled up Southern Airways' current stock price on her computer screen. It had dropped another 2 points since yesterday. The market was starting to notice what she'd seen months ago. This was a company in trouble. Later that afternoon, she drove to her local library. She discovered that some of their oldest newsletters weren't digitized, and she wanted to understand the airline's history. The elderly librarian helped her locate boxes of business newspapers from 20 years ago. Dorothy spent hours going through them, piecing together the story of how Southern Airways had grown from a small regional carrier into what it was today. What she found was fascinating. The airline had once been known for its innovative service and community involvement. But somewhere along the way, new management had taken over, bringing with them outdated attitudes and biases. The change was subtle in the records. A gradual shift in hiring patterns, changes in service policies, small decisions that added up to a big cultural problem. On her drive home, Dorothy passed by the local Southern Airways office. The company's logo, a stylized bird in flight, caught the setting sun. She remembered reading about the logo's designer, a young art student who'd won a contest in the airline's early days. The bird was meant to represent freedom and possibility, ideas that seemed far from the company's current reality. That evening, as she organized her findings, Dorothy's phone buzzed with texts from her grandchildren. They sent her pictures from their day at school, completely unaware that their grandmother was quietly orchestrating one of the biggest corporate takeovers in recent history. She smiled at their photos, remembering why she was doing this. It wasn't just about her experience at the check-in counter anymore. It was about making sure her grandchildren grow up in a world where they'd be judged by their character, not their appearance. Before going to bed, Dorothy added one final note to her growing investigation file. Company vulnerable, but salvageable. The foundation is still there. It just needs the right leadership to rebuild. As she turned out the lights, she knew she was ready to move into the next phase of her plan. The pieces were falling into place, and soon it would be time to act. The conference room at the Golden Plaza Hotel buzzed with quiet energy. Dorothy stood at the head of the long mahogany table, looking at the faces before her. Each person in this room represented decades of experience in banking, investment, and corporate leadership. More importantly, each one had their own story of doors being closed in their faces, of being told they didn't belong. "Thank you all for coming," Dorothy began, her voice steady and clear. "I believe we have an opportunity to do something extraordinary." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing Southern Airways' current market position. Among those gathered was her old friend Robert, now CEO of a major investment firm. He'd started as a janitor at a bank 40 years ago, studying for his business degree at night. Next to him sat Mrs. Wong, who'd built a real estate empire after being told she'd never succeed in American business. Thomas, her former protégé, was taking notes, his fingers flying across his tablet screen. Dorothy walked them through her findings, the airline's financial troubles, the management issues, the opportunity for change. But she wasn't just presenting numbers. She was telling a story about transformation, about taking something broken and making it whole again. "This isn't just about buying an airline," she explained, moving to a slide showing customer satisfaction ratings. "It's about creating a template for change in the industry. When was the last time any of us felt truly welcomed on a flight?" Heads nodded around the table. Mrs. Wong raised her hand, sharing a recent experience of being spoken to in exaggerated simple English despite her 30 years in America. Robert mentioned his teenage son being randomly selected for extra screening on every single flight. The energy in the room shifted from professional interest to personal investment. These weren't just potential investors anymore. They were partners in a mission. Dorothy moved to the financial details. "We need to raise enough capital to acquire a controlling interest," she explained. "I've already committed my retirement portfolio, but we'll need more." She laid out the numbers. Clear, realistic, ambitious but achievable. Mr. Chen, a quiet mutual fund manager known for his conservative approach, spoke up. "The numbers make sense," he said, "but what's your plan for after the takeover?" "Running Airline isn't like managing investments." Dorothy smiled and clicked to her next slide. "I've already had conversations with industry experts who are eager to join us," she explained. "People who've been overlooked for promotion despite their expertise. People who understand both the business and the need for change." The discussion continued through lunch, which was brought in on silver trays. As they ate, stories were shared, not just of discrimination, but of triumph, of barriers overcome, of lessons learned. These were people who'd changed their own industries from the inside out. By late afternoon, commitments were being made. Mrs. Wong pledged her entire annual investment budget. Robert's firm would handle the legal aspects. Thomas had already started drafting the acquisition strategy. Dorothy watched as the room buzzed with activity, people breaking into small groups, making calls, sending emails. Her coalition wasn't just about money. It was about shared vision, shared experience, shared determination. As the meeting wound down, she caught her reflection in the conference room's window. Behind her, some of the most successful business leaders in the country were working together, united by her vision. She thought about that day at the check-in counter, about how the airline staff had seen only what they expected to see. Before everyone left, Dorothy handed out folders containing their next steps. Each person had a role to play, each bringing their unique strengths to the table. "Remember," she said as they prepared to leave, "we're not just buying Airline. We're buying the opportunity to show the world how things should be done." The sun was setting as the last person left the conference room. Dorothy gathered her materials, her heart full. In one afternoon, she'd assembled a team that could move mountains. Soon, they would move an entire airline. The stock market's opening bell hadn't yet rung when Dorothy's team began their carefully orchestrated plan. From her home office, she watched multiple computer screens, each showing different aspects of their operation. Her morning tea sat untouched, growing cold beside her keyboard. First block of shares purchased. Thomas texted from his office downtown. They were buying through different brokers, different firms, keeping each purchase just small enough to avoid attention. Like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together, their ownership of Southern Airways was growing hour by hour. Dorothy's phone rang. It was Mrs. Wong calling from the West Coast. "My team just picked up another 1,000 shares," she reported. "The price is starting to inch up, but not enough to raise eyebrows yet." This was the delicate part of their plan. Buy too quickly, and they'd drive up the price. Buy too slowly, and someone might figure out what they were doing. Dorothy had spent weeks planning this dance, using everything she'd learned in 40 years of banking. Around noon, she took a break to water her orchids, a hobby that had taught her patience over the years. Like nurturing these delicate flowers, taking over a company required a gentle touch. As she misted the purple blooms, her house phone rang. It was her grandson. "Grandma, can you help me with my math homework later?" he asked. Dorothy smiled, thinking about how the numbers she was working with today would surely overwhelm his 7th grade math class. "Of course, sweetheart," she replied. "I'll call you after the market closes." She didn't tell him that she was in the middle of one of the biggest deals of her career. Some lessons about persistence and justice would come later. Back at her desk, Dorothy checked their progress. Their group now owned nearly 30% of the airline's shares, all purchased quietly through different channels. She opened her email to find a message from Robert's team. They'd just secured another block of shares from a retiring board member who had no idea who the real buyers were. The afternoon brought a moment of tension when Southern Airways' stock price jumped unexpectedly. Dorothy watched the numbers climb, her hand steady on her desk. But their careful planning paid off. The price settled back down after an hour. Someone in the company's leadership might have noticed an unusual trading activity, but by then, it would be too late. As the market's closing bell approached, Dorothy received the message she'd been waiting for. Their combined ownership had crossed the critical threshold. She looked at the final tally on her screen, thinking about how numbers on a computer could represent so much more than money. These numbers meant change was coming. She picked up her phone and sent a message to her core team. Phase 1 complete. Meeting tomorrow to begin Phase 2. Then she called her grandson back, ready to help him with his fractions homework. As she explained how parts make up a whole, she thought about how fitting the lesson was for today. That evening, Dorothy sat in her favorite armchair, looking through an old photo album. She found a picture from her first day as a bank teller, back when she'd had to enter through the back door of the building. Next to it was a photo from her last day as a senior investment banker, standing in front of a team she'd built herself. Tomorrow, Southern Airways would wake up to find new owners, though they wouldn't know it yet. The same people they dismissed, overlooked, and disrespected now held their fate in carefully prepared documents and precisely executed stock purchases. Before going to bed, Dorothy checked their final numbers one last time. Everything was in place. She thought about that day at the check-in counter, about the dismissive looks and fake apologies. The airline's leadership had been so busy maintaining their old ways that they never saw the tsunami of change approaching. She slept peacefully that night, dreaming not of revenge, but of transformation. Soon, she would show them what real first-class service looked like, not just in the air, but in every aspect of the company. The silent takeover was complete. Now the real work could begin. The morning of the shareholders' meeting dawned bright and clear. Dorothy stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her cream-colored blazer. She'd chosen her outfit carefully. Professional, powerful, but not flashy. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her grandmother's pearls graced her neck. Today wasn't about intimidation. It was about dignity. The Southern Airways headquarters stretched into the Atlanta sky, its glass windows reflecting the morning sun. Dorothy walked through the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The security guard glanced at her ID badge. She was listed simply as a shareholder representative. His eyes skimmed over her, just as so many had done before. In the elevator, she checked her phone. Messages from her team were pouring in. We're in position. Legal documents ready. Press release prepared. Months of careful planning had led to this moment. As the elevator climbed to the top floor, Dorothy thought about all the people who'd helped make this possible, each one carrying their own stories of being underestimated. The boardroom was already filling up when she arrived. She recognized the faces from her research, the CEO, the board members, the same executive who defended her treatment at the check-in counter months ago. They barely glanced at her as she took a seat near the back. One board member even handed her his empty coffee cup, assuming she was part of the catering staff. The meeting began with the usual formalities. The CEO stood at the podium, talking about quarterly profits and future projections. Dorothy watched him closely. This man who'd fostered a culture where discrimination was accepted as normal. He had no idea his world was about to change. When the time came for shareholder comments, Dorothy stood up quietly. The room fell silent as she walked to the front, her folder of documents in hand. The CEO's patronizing smile froze as she began to speak. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I believe it's time we discussed some changes in leadership." She opened her folder and began distributing documents to the board members. As of yesterday's market close, my investment consortium now owns 51% of Southern Airways shares. The room erupted in confused murmurs. The CEO's face turned pale as he flipped through the papers. Dorothy continued, her voice steady. You might remember me. I was the passenger you refused first-class seating to 4 months ago. Recognition dawned on the executive's face. He started to speak, but Dorothy held up her hand. This isn't about that day, she said. This is about every day. About every person who's been treated as less than worthy of respect. She walked to the head of the table, where Thomas and Robert were now entering with the rest of her team. As majority shareholders, we're calling for an immediate vote on new board leadership. Her words rang through the stunned silence. The next hour was a blur of legal proceedings, votes, and signatures. Dorothy watched as the old guard realized their power was slipping away. Some fought it, others accepted it with quiet resignation. By lunch, Southern Airways had new leadership. As the old board members filed out, Dorothy caught the eye of the executive who dismissed her months ago. He looked away quickly, hurrying toward the door. She didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, only a quiet determination to do better. Once the room had cleared, Dorothy sat in the CEO's chair, now her chair. She looked out over the Atlanta skyline, thinking about all the work ahead. Her phone buzzed with a message from her granddaughter. Did you do it, Grandma? She smiled as she typed back. Yes, sweetheart. And now the real work begins. She could see her reflection in the window. A woman who turned humiliation into transformation, not through anger or revenge, but through wisdom, patience, and strength. The afternoon sun filled the boardroom as Dorothy began her first meeting as CEO. Around the table sat her diverse team of experts, each chosen for their experience, integrity, and vision. Together, they would rebuild Southern Airways from the inside out. As she opened the meeting, Dorothy thought about that morning at the check-in counter. She wasn't angry anymore. Instead, she felt grateful. That experience had led to this moment, this opportunity to create real change. Sometimes, she realized, the best response to discrimination isn't to fight it directly, but to rise so far above it that you can transform the entire system.